Great. Thanks, Signe, for the introduction. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join today as I present the results of this project, studying microclimate conditions and seedling regeneration in Northern Rockies mixed-conifer forests. And before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators, Kim Davis and Phil Higuera at the University of Montana, as well as my funding through the Joint Fire Science Program. And so I really started becoming interested in this topic right when I started my graduate work in the summer of 2017. I was out collecting lake sediment cores from lakes around Montana for a different paleoecological study when the 2017 fires ignited. And I got the chance to watch their progression firsthand and experienced heavy smoke for the first time in my life. And as I'm sure many of you remember, 2017 was a regional fire year in the Northern Rockies and included several large fires close to where I am in Missoula. And this struck me as a good opportunity to get in right after the fires to learn about early post-fire recovery in these forests. And so what I'm presenting today is the results of this project, which has been going on for the past 3 years, really since 2017. So excited to share all of that with you today. And broadly, this work is motivated around understanding the mechanisms of forest resilience to wildfires. And this understanding is critical both from a scientific and a management perspective in a context of climate warming and increasing fire activity, the combined impacts of which have the potential to undermine forest resilience. And so there's evidence of declines in post-fire conifer regeneration, particularly in low elevation dry forests near lower tree line, where climate is becoming less conducive to forest regeneration. But this can also happen in high elevation subalpine forests, which are also sensitive to the effects of fire and post-fire climate, with some evidence of declining recruitment in some areas. And so in this study, we're really focused kind of on mid-elevation forests in between these two extremes, not near lower or upper tree line. And so in these forests, after a fire occurs, tree populations pass through a series of demographic filters, which ultimately determines the long-term trajectory of the forest community over years or even decades after the fire. And firstly, for regeneration to occur, there need to be seeds available through resprouting, release from serotinous cones after the fire, or dispersal from remaining live trees. And secondly, once seeds are present, they need to germinate, survive, and grow to maturity, the result of which is recruitment to the adult population. And these processes are strongly dependent on temperature and moisture availability, with little recruitment when climate conditions exceed species tolerances. And so this is a topic that my collaborator, Kim Davis, has worked on extensively before and presented to the Fire Science Network. So if this is of particular interest to you, I suggest going back and watching her webinar. But the work I'm presenting here was really aimed on building on this prior understanding of the importance of seed availability and post-fire climate for tree regeneration, to get at the effects of additional aspects of fire severity and to better understand what's going on at each of these demographic stages, which have been rarely quantified for Western conifers. And so some evidence suggests that seedling survival and growth depend on microsite factors, including microclimates, competition, and soil conditions, factors which all depend on burn severity. And fire can create favorable conditions for regeneration by increasing the availability of resources such as light and growth limiting nutrients. However, the loss of canopy cover can also alter microclimate conditions to create more stressful growing conditions for seedlings. And microclimate may be a key factor through which changes in climate and fire activity interact. Fire can influence understory microclimate conditions by removing live canopy cover, which intercepts sunlight and helps cool the understory through transpiration. And in a burned area where the trees have been killed, the ground is often darkened by charring and is warmed directly by sunlight, especially right after the fire. So more energy goes into making heat. And these effects of fire on microclimate could reshape larger scale patterns of climatic variability to impact seedling regeneration and ultimately forest recovery. And so this is what we focused on in this study. The first goal of our sampling was to quantify the effects of wildfires on microclimate conditions. And the second main goal was to tease apart the relative influence of seed availability, microclimate, and other microsite factors, including soil nutrient availability, on post-fire seedling demographic processes. And so I'm going to start with our results from these research questions, and then at the end, I'll talk a little bit more about management implications from this work. And so we conducted this study in two large lightning-ignited wildfires from 2017 in the Northern Rockies, the Sunrise and Lolo Peak fires, with a total of 69 plots across these two fires. And we selected these fires because they were close to Missoula, so we'd be able to do some detailed repeat sampling, visiting each plot a total of 4 times over the 3 years post-fire to help quantify different demographic processes, including seedling recruitment, survival, and height growth. And the study sites are in mid-elevation and lower subalpine mixed conifer forests, with mainly ponderosa pine and Douglas fir dominating in warmer, drier sites, and Douglas fir, western larch, and lodgepole pine dominating in mid and high elevation sites, with some subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce present as well. And we sampled systematically across topographic settings, including lower and higher elevations and north and south aspects, as well as fire severity classes, including unburned, moderate, and high severity, to help capture gradients of environmental conditions and fire effects. And at each plot, we counted seedlings and used permanent subplots for ongoing monitoring over the first 3 years after the fires. And sampling involved a lot of hours peering very closely at the ground to find these very tiny young seedlings, which we marked individually if they were within our subplots and tracked over time to estimate survival and growth over the first 3 years after the fires. And we also put out microclimate sensors at a subset of plots, which logged near-ground atmospheric conditions over the first 2 growing seasons post-fire from June to September. So starting with the results from this first question, how do wildfires affect microclimate conditions? Measuring this, we found the temperatures were on average substantially hotter in burned than unburned areas. So these figures are showing microclimate conditions smoothed by time of day over the growing season across plots grouped by fire severity classes. And the second variable, vapor pressure deficit, reflects both temperature and humidity, and higher values correspond to hot and dry atmospheric conditions. And so, as you can see here, differences between burned and unburned sites were biggest during the hottest part of the day in mid-afternoon, with an average of 2.6 degrees Celsius or 4.7 Fahrenheit difference in temperature and 0.5 kilopascals difference in VPD. And just to put this into context, this effect of fire on VPD is comparable to the exchange in mean summer VPD in the US this century. And so we calculated the difference in daily maximum temperature and VPD between paired, burned, and unburned sites in similar topographic settings as a measure of the effect of fire on microclimates, and called these metrics delta T max and delta V max. And we found that this effect of fire on microclimate conditions depended on canopy cover. So here we have our delta T max and delta V max variables on the y-axis. where positive values mean that it was warmer in the burn plot relative to the paired unburned plot. And on the x-axis, we have the difference in canopy cover between paired plots, where negative values mean that it was more open or less shaded in the burned area. And so what this shows is that the greater the canopy loss due to fire, the warmer and drier microclimate conditions were observed. And note that this is total canopy cover, including live and dead canopy. So this highlights that even standing dead trees buffer microclimate by contributing to shading, such that retention of snags after fire could have microclimate benefits. And so we modeled these metrics of the Cmax and delta Vmax as a function of canopy cover, ambient temperature, fire severity, and site climate variables. And our statistical model revealed that the effect of fire on microclimate depended on site climate and ambient temperature in addition to canopy cover. So here, this difference in VPD between unburned and burned plots is on the y-axis, showing predicted values from our statistical models, with larger values meaning that it was warmer in the burned than the unburned plots. And this shows that the effect of fire on microclimate is more pronounced at higher ambient temperatures, so on warmer days. And this effect depends on site climate conditions, with higher predicted values in cool, wet sites with relatively low long-term climatic water deficits, which is a measure of local water availability. And this is because we think warm, dry sites are generally less productive and have less water available to support evaporative cooling. So they don't buffer microclimate conditions as much, even independent of fire effects. And so when there is a fire, it has a smaller relative influence on microclimates. Where in contrast, cool, wet sites are more productive, and the forest canopy before the fire has a really big effect on understory microclimate conditions. So that when the canopy is removed, there's a big change in those microclimate conditions. And so in summary, we found here that the effects of fire on microclimate were substantial, up to a maximum of 12.8 degrees Celsius difference between paired burned and unburned plots during the hottest part of our sampling period. And so these differences are large enough to affect understory plants and tree seedlings. We also found that the effect of fire on microclimate was most pronounced in sites with high severity fire and large losses of canopy cover, in climatically cool, wet sites, and when ambient temperatures are high during the hottest part of the day and the hottest part of the growing season. And so this suggests that seedlings in burned areas are exposed to warm, dry microclimatic conditions and extremes, which could increase the risk of desiccation and mortality. And these effects are most pronounced during hot days and could even become amplified with climate warming. And I think these patterns are easiest to see looking at time series of daily maximum temperature values and plots grouped by fire severity and slope aspect, where you can see really clearly that the largest differences between burned and unburned plots are on north-facing slopes, which are cooler and wetter, and in the hottest part of the summer. And even though the effect of fire is greater on those north-facing slopes, there's a bigger difference between burned and unburned plots. The absolute temperature is still lower in those north-facing plots than on south-facing slopes. So they're still likely to have more favorable environments for seedlings. And so this suggests that post-fire planting may be most effective in relatively more buffered microsites with canopy cover and in cool, wet settings, such as on north-facing slopes. So shifting gears, how did those changes in microclimate conditions and other microsite factors affect post-fire seedling demography. Overall, we found abundant seedling regeneration in the first 3 years after the fires, although it varied widely among sites from an estimated 17 to over 500,000 seedlings per hectare, with a median density of 2,600. And so comparing post-fire seedling density on the y-axis here to reconstructed pre-fire density on the x-axis, 2/3 of plots were at or above replacement density, above this 1-to-1 line, and over half were above 2 times replacement, suggesting that these forests will recover from these fires. And this abundant regeneration that we found is due in part to the fact that we limited our sampling to within 100 meters of a live canopy. So seed availability was likely not strongly limiting in our study site. However, looking across the whole area of these 2 fires, these maps are showing the distance to a non-severe patch, which would have live trees to provide seeds for regeneration. And across these 2 fires, there were few large high severity patches greater than 100 meters from a seed source, averaging only 10% of the total burned area. So the regeneration observed in our plots may be largely representative of these fires. In addition, the abundant regeneration we found is also likely due in part to moderate post-fire climate conditions, where this is showing the growing season average daily maximum temperature over June to September in Missoula, Montana, with the box plots showing the range over 1981 to 2020, and the points showing the 3 post-fire years, which were generally pretty close to average. So these were moderate post-fire climate years. And this moderate climate contributed to abundant annual recruitment and high survival rates of seedlings, averaging greater than 50% in burned areas. And in fact, survival was higher on average in burned than unburned plots, suggesting that fire opened up opportunities for tree regeneration here. And in addition, annual recruitment declined over time, even within these first 3 post-fire years, really emphasizing the importance of this early post-fire regeneration. And so these 2 fires provide an example of how forests can be resilient to fire under moderate climate conditions, showing that regeneration failures are not yet the rule everywhere, even though these are just a couple of examples. So what were the driving factors controlling spatial variability in seedling densities, which spanned several orders of magnitude among our plots? To answer that, we built a statistical model of total seedling density at 3 years post-fire in burned plots, which accounted for 75% of the total variability in seedling density. And so this graph shows the partial effect of the predictor on expected seedling density, which is represented on the y-axis using a log scale. And we used a z-score transformation for all of our predictors that scales the measurements to a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, which basically allows us to directly compare the slopes of each predictor relationship in terms of effect size or relative influence on seedling regeneration. And so consistent with our expectations, we found that seed availability was an important factor here. Regeneration was higher on average in sites with many lodgepole pine trees, which we used as a proxy for the presence of serotinous cones. And most lodgepole pine seedlings germinated in the first year after fire, so that effect is most pronounced early on. And tree regeneration was also higher in sites closer to live seed sources, with this seed source here on the x-axis. And just for reference, I've added the raw values to this scale here, so you can see that. In addition, regeneration was higher in sites with warm, dry microclimate conditions. So that was an important factor as well, consistent with what we expected to see. And we used our field-based microclimate data to derive this metric of maximum summer temperature at each plot, reflecting differences in microclimate among sites due to topographical position and vegetation structure and productivity affecting understory microclimate conditions after the fires. And we also found strong effects of fire severity, which differed depending on the severity metric considered. So expected regeneration was greater here in sites with higher tree mortality and canopy loss, suggesting that an increase in light availability due to canopy opening is beneficial for regeneration, all else equal. So this suggests there may be some trade-off in terms of some reduction in canopy cover being beneficial through increased light availability, whereas too much canopy loss could also be detrimental through microclimate effects. So there may be some optimal level of shading in these post-fire environments. Regeneration also increased with moss and forb cover and declined with bare ground cover. And this suggests that perhaps mosses and forbs are associated with higher soil moisture or help contribute to microclimate buffering by insulating the near ground environment, similar to the effects of like coarse woody debris. And these also may be less competitive with seedlings than grasses or shrubs have often been shown to be. Where in contrast, bare ground could be associated with higher surface temperatures or higher erosion rates. And anecdotally, we did see some seedlings that either were buried by soil or washed out where there was erosion in high severity sites. And this may imply opportunities for microsite selection for replanting in more favorable understory environments. And finally, we found negative relationship between regeneration and soil nitrogen availability. And we found that soil nitrogen content and availability were several-fold higher in the first year after fire compared with unburned plots, but varied widely among sites, suggesting that nitrogen was not limiting to seedling growth in these areas. And it's possible that a very high nitrogen supply could have potentially altered the allocation of growth between roots and above ground biomass of seedlings, which could have increased vulnerability to desiccation. It's also likely that fire effects on nitrogen supply are associated with other changes in soil conditions that affect seedlings, such as mycorrhizal colonization, for example. But there are lots of aspects of soil conditions that we didn't measure. So there's definitely opportunities here for future research to tease out these underlying mechanisms. But it is possible that selecting replanting sites with relatively low soil burn severity could also improve reforestation success based on these results. And so we also built additional statistical models to compare the controls of seedling regeneration among species, including Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and western larch, which are the most abundant species in our plot. And so this figure is showing the coefficient estimates with 95% confidence intervals for the best fit model of seedling density for all species together, which is the same as all of the results I've already just shown you. So essentially these values on the x-axis here correspond to the slope of the relationship between each predictor variable and seedling density, or its effect size, with variables grouped by category in terms of seed availability, climate, and fire severity variables. And so in general, all species had strong declines in regeneration with greater distance to seed source, or increases in regeneration with higher conspecific basal area or propagule pressure, which is a measure of the density of live seed sources surrounding the plot, estimated using aerial imagery. all species also had negative effects of warm, dry, site climate or microclimate variables on density. So in general, species showed similar sensitivity to seed availability and climate variables. However, the effects of fire severity differed slightly among species, where, for example, Douglas fir was more abundant in areas of low fire severity, unlike the all species model, perhaps because it's relatively shade tolerant compared to these other species. So there's a lot of detail here in all of these different variables, which I'm not going to go into, but altogether, this suggests that fine scale heterogeneity in fire effects, even within patches classified as high severity, can create diverse microsite environments to support regeneration of different species. And so digging into demographic processes a little bit more, these different microsite factors influenced overall regeneration in part through seedling survival. And survivorship rates were generally high in our plots and increased with seedling age, with a median of 100% survival of the oldest seedlings 3 years after the fires. And our statistical models revealed that not only was survival lowest in the youngest seedlings, but young seedlings were also more sensitive to climate conditions, where this is showing the partial effect of long-term climatic water deficit on seedling survival, with a stronger decline in expected survival in warm, dry sites for younger seedlings. And so this really highlights the importance of germination year climate for natural regeneration and suggests that older planted seedlings could actually potentially be a little bit hardier in sites with marginal climate. And survivorship also varied as a function of microsite factors, including moss and fork cover, canopy cover, and soil nitrate availability, as shown here with partial effects plots from our statistical model. And this shows that microsite conditions are important for seedling survival, similar to overall regeneration. And in terms of seedling growth, we found that growth rates mainly depended on species identity, where this is showing partial effects for predicted height in the 3rd year after fire, with larch and ponderosa pine being the tallest. And growth rates were also higher in sites with moss and fork cover, perhaps due to soil moisture, and in relatively warm, dry sites. Perhaps because taller species were more prevalent in low elevation and south-facing plots. And so species like larch and ponderosa pine may be able to take advantage of open, burned areas and grow quite quickly. And so in summary, we found that early post-fire regeneration was abundant, providing an example of how forests can be resilient to fire in years with moderate climate conditions. We also found that seedling recruitment and survival decreased with warm, dry microclimate and varied in complex ways with microsite factors, including overstory, understory, and soil conditions. And this highlights that patchy fire behavior and traits such as cone serotiny can support forest resilience through seed provision, while even finer scale heterogeneity in fire effects also supports regeneration by creating favorable microsite environments. And anticipating a future with warmer climate and high fire activity, our results imply that seedlings will be increasingly exposed to warm, dry, and microclimate extremes, which could potentially limit regeneration. For example, our models predict that an increase in maximum summer temperature of about 2 degrees Celsius above the average we measured would be expected to decrease seedling densities by an average of 26%, or about 1,000 seedlings per hectare below the current predicted mean of 4,100, all else equal. And this is most likely in areas of high severity fire and in years with warm, dry climate conditions. and could occur even in relatively cool, moist topographic settings. And this could favor a shift in species composition with greater prevalence of more drought and fire adapted species like larch and lodgepole pine. And because we're talking about mid-elevation forests here, where there's quite a bit of overlap in low elevation and subalpine forest species distributions, we may not expect large areas of forest loss, but rather a shift in species, where we might expect forests to contract near lower tree line as climate becomes unsuitable. But in these mid-elevation zones, fire could create opportunities for differential regeneration of species. And forest loss would be more likely limited to very large, high severity patches lacking stratinous lodgepole pine, as well as areas of very severe burning with unfavorable microclimate and microsite conditions. And so reforestation can even help accelerate this process of species composition change and species adjustment to climate through things like assisted gene flow, which my collaborator, Kim Davis, currently has a project studying the potential for that. And there are a few management implications of this work. First, the strong influence of canopy shading, even from standing dead trees, suggests that retention of at least some snags after a fire promotes regeneration through microclimatic buffering. And this is a photo of one of our burn sites 1 year after the fire. And you can see this was a high severity fire, but there are quite a lot of these fine branches and even dead needles retained on the trees that contribute to some of that post-fire shading. And second, management actions that promote heterogeneity in stand structure and fire effects before, during, and after a fire could promote forest resilience. An example of that might be managed wildfire use under moderate climate conditions to promote that patchy fire behavior. And third, we suggest that it may be beneficial to target planting in favorable microsites, where there is some canopy cover, and I know that that's a widespread practice, but also moss and fore cover may be good indicators of where soil moisture is relatively high or soil is more stable. And there may be less competition from grasses and shrubs in those sites as well. And more research is needed on this question, but we did find this to be a strong correlation of moss and fore cover with seedling density, survival, and growth rate. And finally, our data highlight the importance of the first few years after fire for natural post-fire regeneration, and emphasize that seedlings are most sensitive to environmental factors during the germination year. So if there is flexibility to wait and see, whatever degree that there is, planting may not be needed if there's a moderate climate year and natural regeneration within the first few years after the fire. And those seedlings are able to survive past their germination year to when they're a little bit hardier. And in addition, while our field-based microclimate metrics were important in our statistical models of seedling density, models using fine-scale gridded climate data, including 250-meter long-term climatic water deficit, performed nearly as well at predicting seedling densities, which supports the use of predictive models with fine-scale climate data for reforestation planning. Because I know that field-based microclimate data is definitely not trivial to be able to collect. So using that gridded data can be quite useful. And one example of this is regeneration, a tool which is under development by Zach Holden and others, which predicts the probability of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine regeneration above a threshold density across a burned area based on distance to seed source and gridded climate data. And comparing outputs from regeneration with our data, we did find that there was some correspondence, although we would have to sample across more areas without regeneration to fully validate the tool. But this certainly is a promising tool for reforestation efforts in burned areas. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Phil Higuera and Kim Davis, as well as my many amazing undergrad research assistants who hiked all over these burned areas with me time after time to find these tiny seedlings, as well as Solomon Dabrowski, Vince Archer, Alana Shaw, and Corey Cleveland, who also helped out with this project in various ways, and my funding through the Joint Fire Science GRIN program. And I'll take questions.
All right, thanks a lot, Kira. This is Signy. Just a reminder to all of you, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat box right now. And I hope that you are able to type them in if you have questions. So I have a quick question for you while folks gather their thoughts. I think it was one of your first slides showing the effects of burn severity on, I believe, microclimate. And in that slide, it looked like there wasn't much difference between moderate severity and high severity. Do you think that had, do you have any thoughts about that? Or did that have to do maybe with the time that things were sampled, that some of the needles and other pieces of a moderate burn may have already fallen? I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
You're right. Averaged across all of our sites, we didn't see that come out in those categorical fire severity classes all that much. And I think part of that is because in areas of high severity surface fire, there was a lot of that, like fine needles and fine branches retained that contributed to shading. So we saw those differences more in those continuous metrics of canopy cover than those categorical classes. I think partly because we were sampling right after the fires. So all of those needles were retained in those areas with high severity surface fire where the canopy wasn't consumed. Yeah.
All right, thanks. Okay, there's a couple questions coming in here. I have a question related to future drought years. Do you have any thoughts on how susceptible seedlings might be in the future? And you kind of alluded to that with some of the temperature changes, but any other thoughts on how this might relate to climate change and what we have coming?
Yeah, well, so we did see that these effects of fire on microclimate were bigger when ambient temperatures were higher. So that does suggest that with climate change and warming ambient temperatures, we might see like larger microclimate extremes in these burned areas, which could limit seedling regeneration. And our models provide some estimate of how big that effect could be, but that is an extrapolation. So we're not, I wouldn't use that as a predictive quantitative estimate, but it certainly suggests that seedlings could be more sensitive to future climate. And even though we did see higher survival in older seedlings in these sites in moderate climate years, it is still possible that a severe drought year could severely limit survival even among older seedlings, and that has been seen in other cases. So it's not 100% certain that these forests will recover over the longer term. It depends on what the climate does in the next few years and what those extremes are.
All right, thanks. I'm just going to read this question off. For the stronger differences between temperatures among burn severity in the summertime, like July and August, do you think this is an outcome of overall higher temperatures or also an increase in solar radiation? What was the distance to the ground for your microclimate temperature measurements?
The distance to the ground was 10 centimeters. So I suspect it was mostly related to ambient temperature, just because, well, I mean, it could be higher solar radiation as well, because that affects temperature near the ground. Yeah, I guess I don't know 100%.
All right, thanks. And related to your definition of fire severity, is it based on soil, vegetation, or both? I guess, how did you classify your fire severity?
Yeah, so the fire severity classes, any of those categorical classes, were based on satellite metrics, based on MTBS data. But in terms of the continuous metrics we used in our statistical models, we developed those ourselves based on field measurements that incorporated like ground cover data, including soil exposure, as well as tree mortality and canopy loss and scorch height. So those incorporated a bunch of those field-based metrics.
All right, thanks.
Yeah.
This question is about your comment that waiting to see how natural regeneration establishes might reduce the need to plant seedlings. Your photos showed a large amount of grass and forbs coming in many of the locations. There are shrubs as well. Would it be realistic to say that the competition provided by these other plants may hinder establishment of planted seedlings if natural regeneration isn't successful?
Yes, that's certainly possible. We did find very high natural seedling regeneration densities in areas even that were like totally blanketed in fireweed. So forbs may not be as competitive or as limiting to regeneration either of naturally seeded seedlings or planted seedlings. But shrubs and grasses certainly have been shown to be competitive, and that could be a limiting factor. We didn't really look at that. So yes, there is a possibility that that could become limited as that herbaceous cover comes back in.
Okay, and did you assess, I know there were probably various levels of forest management that occurred in your study area in the past. Did you assess seedling regen or survival in old regeneration harvest units post-fire? So did you see any impact on management activities that happened prior to the fire on regen?
You know, that's a great question. I've been meaning to look at that. None of these sites had forest management. I think going back to the 70s was the most recent and of anything. So yeah, I'm not sure on that, but just anecdotally, we do have Kim Davis also has some plots out in the Liberty Fire, which is in areas of more recent intensive logging and stuff like that. And she found much lower regeneration there compared with these sites. And that was the same fire year and similar forest types. So there may be an impact of forest management on natural regeneration as well. But that's an open question.
All right, thanks. And we've got one more question here. So folks, if you have any more questions, please type them in now. How did mixed conifer regen compare with the influx of invasive brush species such as ceanothus?
Yeah, we did see ceanothus. We also saw some spotted knapweed out in these areas. I didn't look at that specifically in terms of relationships with seedling densities that we found. Yeah, so I'm not sure, but it wasn't, none of the sites were totally overrun by invasives or anything like that. And none of the sites with low seedling densities seemed to have any higher density of those invasives. So I'm not sure.